Okay, yes, thank you so much. And first of all, let me thank you all, the organizers, for having invited us and giving us the opportunity to speak in this important meeting. So thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I'm very sorry not to be there in presence, but I will try my best to convey the message and also to answer to your questions and provide correct answers. So today we will be talking about a little bit the performance evaluation that needs to be conducted for the vigilance function to be listed as a WHO listed authorities. Before going into the details of the requirement for the global benchmarking tool and also the performance evaluation which is needed to reach this objective, I will also give you a little bit of introduction of what is the GBT and PE in the context of the WLA framework. So let's start from the beginning. As you know, the WHO listed authority is a regulatory authority that is demonstrated to comply with a set of requirements. These requirements can be generally grouped into two main components. The first component is the so-called global benchmarking tool. I'm pretty sure you are very much aware of what this is. And the global benchmarking tool is in fact the core of this evaluation, which is then amplified, let's say, or complemented with an additional performance evaluation, which will lead into the transformation, or actually in the designation of a WHO listed authority. So the recognition that this authority is in fact acting, complying with all these requirements. But when we talk about GBT and PE, so global benchmarking tool and performance evaluation, there are some differences that need to be understood. And these differences are mainly related to the fact that while the global benchmarking tool was built to build the capacity in member states, indeed the performance evaluation framework has been built to measure the performance of these regulatory systems. Basically, we always say that the GBT is to identify how this regulatory system is structured, what are the components, if all the expected components are in fact in place, while the performance evaluation is in fact needed to see how this regulatory system is operating. So you see that the objective is always the regulatory system, but at different aspects of the regulatory system. Let's try to understand what are the differences or the main differences related to this type of evaluation. In this picture, you see how the regulatory system can be identified. You see, it's a very complex beast, I would say. So it is composed for sure of the regulatory institutions, so the national regulatory authorities, the national control laboratories, and all other institutions, including the pharmacovigilance centers. I would like to always highlight where the pharmacovigilance is in all these slides. So you see the pharmacovigilance centers are included in the regulatory system, but together with a number of other things, like, for example, the regulatory functions that we will talk about a little bit more in detail in a few slides, but also the regulatory framework, which is including the legal framework and also the regulation, guidelines, and other guidance documents. For sure, it includes the resources, and then the quality management system, which is generally used to govern all these elements and make this regulatory system working properly. So all the combination of all these components forms the regulatory system. And this is in fact the primary focus of the global benchmarking tool. But this regulatory system is not just a standalone entity. It works to transform regulatory inputs into regulatory outputs. And this is a sort of machine, or is a sort of engine that is working to transform all these inputs into outputs. Then these outputs will eventually transform into outcomes and impact. But as you can see here, the objective of the performance evaluation will not be outcomes and impact, but only the regulatory outputs. Why? Well, because the outcomes and the impact of the regulatory system are in fact depending not only on the regulatory system itself, but on a number of other stakeholders and input and other entities which may be involved, including the Ministry of Health, for example, or including the health system indeed. So basically, these are the differences. The focus of the global benchmarking tool is the regulatory system, while the focus of the performance evaluation is the regulatory outputs. Let me highlight a few examples. This picture is in fact contained in the operational guidance, which is one of the main documents of the WLA framework. And let me just highlight what is important for you in this meeting. So basically what is related to the pharmacovigilance. You see reporting adverse drug reactions and, for example, market complaints, these could be considered inputs for in the case of pharmacovigilance, while for the outputs, we are looking at the regulatory actions taken after some evaluations conducted, or, for example, change in the approved product labeling information, and so on. We normally use this example to explain better what are the differences between GPT and PE. Imagine you have to deliver a parcel by a car. For sure, to deliver this parcel, you will need several different elements, like, for example, the car, like, for example, the fuel, like, for example, good roads and the condition of the roads, the driver, actually, hopefully, with a valid driving license, also a map and address to be reached. Actually, this is what the global benchmarking tool is looking at, how all these elements are established and implemented. While when we go to the performance evaluation, what we are looking at is, for example, the duration of which is taken for this delivery to take place, or when the delivery is conducted, what are the conditions of the package at the end, what is the reputation and the consistency of this company, which is in our case the regulatory system, how the communication is happening between the regulatory system, actually this company and the client, and what is also the cost effectiveness. So these are the two main differences, and this needs to be taken into account whenever we look at the requirements which are contained into the GPT and into the performance evaluation framework. So now let's have a look at more in depth of what this global benchmarking tool is and how this is somehow targeting the pharmacovigilance function. You know that the global benchmarking tool is just one, or actually the first, of 5 steps, which are part of the so-called 5-step capacity building models for national regulatory authorities. This model has been built several years ago by WHO, and it was meant for capacity building, in fact. So that is why it is coming, and we always say that the global benchmarking tool is for capacity building. It's the first step because this tool has been used then in years, and actually is being used to benchmark the national regulatory system and identify their maturity level. We will talk about this in a few seconds. And then to formulate, and this is the most important part, the institutional development plan. It means that we end up with providing recommendations to these regulatory systems which are benchmarked, recommendations which are meant to fill the gaps that are identified. And then also, this is also extremely important, WHO is also providing technical support, actually as technical support and training and learning and networking to build up and identify and fill the gaps as we mentioned. So this is the intention of the global benchmarking tool. You know, and this is very well known, that the global benchmarking tool is also considering several regulatory functions. It's just a system to identify to simplify this very complex beast that we identified as the regulatory system and all the activities that are conducted therein. And I wanted just to highlight the fact that vigilance function is there, and you consider that this is one of the common functions. It means that whatever pharmaceutical product we are considering, the vigilance function is one of the pillars, most important pillars that we need to consider for having a regulatory system which is considered, let's say, operational or functional. And you see that the vigilance function is also starting from the very beginning during the clinical trial phase till the end, actually, for the entire product life cycle. And we also said that the global benchmarking tool is based on the identification of maturity levels. And you know exactly, maybe better than me, that we have 4 maturity levels identified. This concept has been taken from the ISO 9004, and it has been recognized that maturity level 3 is in fact the minimum requirements to be sure that this regulatory system is in fact working at an acceptable level. Whatever is below maturity level 3 is still considered suboptimal, let's say. So working, but not at the acceptable level. And then, of course, we have maturity level, which is the highest level that we can have. The global benchmarking tool has 2 technical documents that we need to refer to. One is exactly named the global benchmarking tool, which is containing indicators and sub-indicators. I will explain the difference in a second. And the other one, which is also very important, is the manual for benchmarking and formulation of institutional development plans, which is in fact containing operational details of how this benchmarking should be conducted. It is a document which is useful not only for the assessee, but also for assessors, who need to be very much familiar when they approach the benchmarking activity. So the global benchmarking tool we mentioned is composed in a hierarchical way. So basically at the very top of this pyramid, we have the system and functions, which is exactly what I mentioned before. Basically this common function that has been recognized to be necessary in all product streams, at least the pharmaceutical product streams. And we have here the vigilance function, which is identified in this place, while we also have non-common functions which can be recognized in different type of product categories, like, for example, the lot releases associated with vaccines, but not with chemicals or traditional medicines. Below the systems, below the functions, we have the indicators. Actually, these indicators are identifying cross-sectional categories, I would say, cross-sectional subjects, cross-sectional items that are almost present in all the regulatory functions, at least most of them. These are present in the regulatory system for sure, function, but however, in all the other functions, we have common cross-sectional, common categories like this, for example, the legal provisions, for example, the human resources, for example, the quality risk management. These are all present in the other functions. But the most important part of this hierarchical structure is the sub-indicators. Why I'm saying that? Because the sub-indicators is the only thing that we can score. So in fact, we cannot score indicators, we cannot score functions. What we score is the sub-indicators, and based on the scoring of the sub-indicator, and this will be generating and somehow impacting the maturity level, which is assigned to that specific function and ultimately also to the regulatory system itself. And there are different levels of implementation that can be found in each sub-indicators and can be recognized, and these different levels will give the possibility to these sub-indicators to be considered implemented or not. In addition, these sub-indicators are somehow associated to a maturity level. So this is how the single scoring of sub-indicators can impact the maturity level of the entire regulatory system. I will tell you in a second how this works. Below that, there is also another important part, which is the fact sheet. The fact sheet is basically an important document. It took many years to be developed and several consultations with several stakeholders, because it is including descriptions, scopes, rationale, all the requirements, and also all the explanations that need to be understood before providing, to reach the implementation, the full implementation of those requirements. The fact sheet is also accompanied, actually below the sub-indicators, we also have some complementary activities that we normally identify as, for example, the observed audit. And I would like to highlight this one, the vigilance field visit. Why am I highlighting this one? Because the vigilance field visit is also present, we will see it in a second, in the performance evaluation. So basically it's repeated twice at the level of the capacity building activity conducted during the benchmarking, but also during the performance evaluation process. And this is important, and we will look at the differences between the two, because there are in fact differences for the reason we already mentioned. These are the figures, updated figures for the currently available version of the global benchmarking tool, which for vigilance function identifies 26 sub-indicators. These sub-indicators, as you see, are associated to different levels of maturity. We have the majority of them belonging to maturity level 3, and then we have some of them belonging to maturity level 1, 2, and 4. And I will give you the details of how these are distributed for the vigilance function. The fact sheet template, why I mentioned this is so important. Actually, you see that it is providing you what is the maturity level to which this sub-indicator is impacting. And this will be important because, of course, If it's impacting or associated to that maturity level and it's not implemented, it will impact the possibility for that regulatory function to reach that maturity level. It will also identify the scope and of the application of this sub-indicator, the description of what is meant, what is expected for these sub-indicators, but it also provide also the requirements, the evidence or the documents that are expected to be presented and to submit and to be somehow supporting the implementation of these sub-indicators, and also very importantly, the references. What are the international guidelines or WHO guidelines which are considered when important when implementing these sub-indicators? This is why this fact sheet is so important. This is giving you the idea of how this capacity building is reached. Actually, in this sense, the explanation of each and every requirement is in fact demonstrating and helping the assessors and the assessee especially, and so the regulatory system which wants to reach this maturity, a higher maturity level, it can be used to also prioritize the type of activities to be implemented in order to reach the objective. This is how more or less in general the indicators are associated to maturity level. Very generally speaking, whenever we talk about maturity level 1, we are talking about the foundational regulations which are important for the regulatory system to be established and running. Then we will build upon ML1 with indicators which are looking at other type of regulations, a little bit below the legal provisions, including guidelines, for example, or guidance documents more than guidelines. Processes and resources are mainly covered by sub-indicators which are associated to maturity level 3, while for maturity level 4, we are looking at something which can be added to have an advanced level of performance of the regulatory system, but which are somehow expected to be implemented once everything is already being set and running properly. And here also you have some of the elements which are cross-cutting for the entire regulatory system, including, for example, the good regulatory practices, which is one of the main targets of the global benchmarking tool. Let's have a look more in depth now that we have the basis already ascertained. Let's have a look on how all these things that I've mentioned are integrated in the vigilance function. You see, in the WHO Global Benchmarking Tool, the definition of the vigilance function is this one, like science and activities relating to detection, assessment, understanding, and prevention of adverse effects or any other medical product-related problem. What is expected from the global benchmarking tool? That the reporting system is established and for monitoring the safety of medical products. That this monitoring and monitoring and an assessment happen for side effects, but also other product-related safety issues, whatever are they, both for product like medicines and product like vaccines. That all kinds of patient harm are in fact considered. Whatever is the cause of this harm, like inadequate product quality, inappropriate use, or intrinsic adverse effect. That also a networking is established because it's specifically for the pharmacovigilance function, it is extremely important to participate and have international collaboration with other regulatory authorities which are performing the same activity, because this is, I would say, key for the correct running of this function. And then also, last but not least, maybe I would say also the most important is informed science-based decision taken. So based on something which is reproducible and accountable. The vigilance function is organized, as we mentioned before, in 6 out of the 9 categories that I've showed you before, 6 indicators. So these are the 6 indicators. So the 6 cross-sectional, let's say, category, which are considered in the global benchmarking tool for having the vigilance function implemented. The first one is legal provision. As I mentioned, this legal provision is the foundation of any regulatory system, and in fact is also important for the vigilance function. Then we have the governance, so basically how this is managed at the level of the regulatory system, and also the level of the health system for what concerns the vigilance function. Then we have human resources. Then we have, which is detached from the general resources, like financial resources are considered elsewhere. Under the vigilance function, we have human resources. Then we have procedures. Then we have evaluation and monitoring, and then we have transparency. In this slide, I have summarized all the 26 sub-indicators that I was mentioning before. I will not go into the details of any of this one, but just to let you understand, I've used this color code to identify maturity level 1. You see, these are as light red. Light yellow is for indicating ML2, light green is for indicating ML3, and dark green, let's say, is for indicating ML4. Just that you understand, you see that whatever it is, maturity level 1 and 2 is mostly concentrated in this part, as we mentioned before. So this is just a demonstration of what I showed you before in general. Also in the case of the vigilance function, you see that maturity level 1 and 2 are mostly associated to the legal provision, because we said is the first building block of any regulatory system. And then we have also governance, which is there, with few exceptions, with few exceptions like this one. The access to information regulatory authority. Why this is maturity level 1? Because again, this is foundational. If the staff of the personnel of the regulatory system has no access or not enough access to the information, it cannot run the function at all. So this is the reason why this maturity level 1 indicators is associated and is present in this indicator, like procedures, indicator number 4 for procedure. And also here, transparency. Look, transparency, it is generally associated to ML3, and you know that in the majority of functions, indeed, transparency is always associated to ML4. In the vigilance function, there is a difference. Actually, this is so important that is considered maturity level 3. What does that mean? It means that it needs to be implemented always to be for the regulatory system itself, not only the regulatory function, but actually the regulatory function first and then the regulatory system itself to be considered ML3, because this is one of the most foundational parts of the vigilance function. Then we have all these maturity level 3 and 4, which are spread all over the other indicators. And I would just like to also underline the fact that we have in total 4 indicators, which are maturity level 4, which are here. I'm saying this because this will be important when we will look at the performance evaluation of the vigilance function. So now let's move to the performance evaluation framework. Even in this case, we have a couple of documents which are really important. The first one is the operational guidance. The second one being the so-called performance evaluation manual, in which you can find all the details of what I'm going to tell you. Before starting to understand how the performance evaluation framework is conducted, we need to consider a couple of things. First of all, it has been developed taking into consideration the good regulatory practices, as we mentioned, but particularly, you know that the GRP regulatory practices contains a number of principles and a number of enablers, and these number of principles are basically 9, but for these 4 are considered much more important in the development of the performance evaluation framework. So we start with the consistency. So basically, this is taking into consideration the reproducibility or the accountability of the regulatory system itself. Then we look at the flexibility, the capability of the regulatory system to adjust its evaluations and its performance depending on the situation and also on the emergencies, for example, or the health crisis. The efficiency, and this is very much linked to performance. So again, imagine that we are now looking at the performance of the regulatory system. So we are very much interested in the efficiency and also transparency. This is a hallmark of all regulatory systems considered by WHO, and is extremely important when we are talking about WHO listed authorities, because the idea is that these authorities, as you know, will be acting as a model for other regulatory systems. So it's important that they are transparent in what they are doing, how they are doing, and what are the results of their evaluations. And in terms of enablers, these are the most important 3. As I mentioned before, the science and data-driven decision-making process, which is extremely important, the presence of a robust and well-functioning quality management system, and effective communication, collaboration, and coordination. And you understand better than me how in the pharmacovigilance function this can be really crucial. I'm sure you know very well this slide. So just to remind you, that when we started the performance evaluation, the regulatory system is already considered maturity level 3. So this means that all sub-indicators which are included as MR 1, 2, and 3 have been already assessed and found compliant and found appropriately implemented. So in fact, the performance evaluation is basically composed of 3 main parts. The main part is still, again, belonging to the global benchmarking tool, is looking at maturity level 4 indicators, sub-indicators. Some of them are considered mandatory. And you remember we have 4 maturity level 4 indicators in the vigilance function. Some of them should be considered mandatory. While we have some indicators, and then we have some so-called tools. And I would like to highlight the fact that, again, these tools are not for all functions, only for 5 functions. Again, the pharmacovigilance function is there. It's one of the most complex, let's say, I would say, functions to be assessed, and also to be, it contains a number of requirements that need to be met. When it comes to the indicators, just a few words. For the indicators, you always will find a very similar fact sheet, which is very important. Again, this is important to understand what are the requirements and how we can implement those requirements. It contains more or less the same type of information that I showed you before, and is important for understanding how to implement them. Considering the tools, I will come back to this one later on, but the tool that we are looking for, the vigilance field visit, contains a sort of handbook. This, I mean, it is provided, this handbook, in the performance evaluation manual. So this is important for you to take a look at that one, to have an idea of what are the requirements. So we mentioned for the vigilance regulatory function, these are the 3 components. You see that the indicators that are necessary, so the mandatory indicators in the vigilance functions are 4. So basically all my ML4 sub-indicators are considered mandatory for vigilance function. This is the only function in which this is happening. That is why I told you this is one of the most complex to be implemented. So all of them, that means that the regulatory system which wants to be listed for the vigilance function must be ML4. Full ML4, because everything should be fully implemented. On top of this, we have 7 indicators, and again, this is the highest number that we have in every function in the performance evaluation framework. We always have a variable number which ranges from 1 to 4, and we have only 7 in the vigilance function. And then we have again this field visit, and now we should look at a little bit in more details to this field visit. I'm reporting here, again, a picture which is taken from the performance evaluation manual related to the vigilance function. This is more or less the flow chart of the evaluation, how it goes. You see that this is a stepwise approach, and only if the first step is concluded, we can move on to the next one. So the first thing is that to identify when a regulatory system wants to be listed for the vigilance function, the first thing will be to identify, or actually to verify that the eligibility criteria are met. And you know that this eligibility criteria means having maturity level 3 fully implemented. So if this is the case, yes, we can go ahead. Then we will start asking the regulatory system to provide a sort of self-assessment of these indicators, of the so-called performance evaluation indicators. And then an evaluation will be conducted off-site by a team of assessors. This is the list of the 7 indicators you see. And again, this is a very specific thing that happens only in the vigilance function. These are very quantitative indicators. All of them, the 7 of them, are quantitative indicators. Not much to have flexibility in the interpretation. It doesn't need a lot of flexibility in understanding or actually in interpreting what is meant for these requirements. This is really talking about numbers, percentages, number, percentages of several activities which are related to the vigilance function. When all these 7 indicators are considered implemented, then we can move on to the vigilance field visit. The vigilance field visit is assessing, and again, this is conducted both in the context of the benchmarking and in the context of the performance evaluation. I will tell you in a second what are the differences. But the most important, one of the important things to bear in mind is that is assessing the performance at 3 levels. We are not only looking at the central level, so at the level of the regulatory system, but also at subnational level and also at health facility level. So very deeply and very specifically at the level of the health facility. It covers systems, structure, detection and reporting of and data management, case investigation and analysis, risk assessment and management, information, education and communication with the stakeholders and with relevant groups, resources, human and financial, which may be needed at the 3 levels, and also medical products utilization. Of course, in the assessment, risk-based approach is always used. Let's have a look at more details. These are the number of indicators, actually indicators and sub-indicators which are present in this tool. Imagine that we have a vaccine vigilance system and medicine vigilance system, which is treated separately. So we are looking separately at the different type of requirements. And you see how many indicators are developed for the 2 things. So what are the differences? I promised to give you a little bit of more details about the differences. Actually here, just to remind, the GBT is for capacity building, and so these differences are for these reasons, and while the performance evaluation is for measuring performance. So the first difference is related to the duration. Indeed, the vigilance field visit is conducted during the benchmarking. It's conducted together in parallel with the benchmarking for 1 day. And while in the performance evaluation, this activity will be conducted over a week, 5 working days, I would say. So there is a mission which is separately conducted and separately organized and arranged to be sure that all the important sites are somehow visited. In terms of number of sites and number of facilities, generally in the capacity building approach, we are looking at a couple of them. So basically we will look maybe at one health center or one hospital and one province. For example, if we have provinces or district, we will look at one of them because it's just a sample, just one of the samples that we can take. Generally is also somehow convenient to be reached from the site where the benchmarking is taking place, which is generally the capital of the country. While in the case of the performance evaluation, actually we are selecting 2-3 provinces, so the team will travel a lot in the territory. I mean, provided that this territory is containing provinces, districts, or whatever it is, but the number of facilities visited will be always around 4 to 6, including community health centers, including hospitals, including the Ministry of Health, including regional offices, provincial offices, district offices, as applicable, of course, so depending on the structure of the system. At the end of the evaluation, some recommendations are always issued whenever, of course, if areas for improvement are identified, of course, recommendations are issued. While in this other case, recommendation may be issued. It's not a must. Why? Because recommendations are targeting the root cause of a problem that has been identified. So it means that the person who is performing the assessment, so the assessor, the WHO assessor, is somehow identifying or actually is helping the regulatory system to identify the root cause to issue a recommendation. In this other case, actually, this is not exactly expected from the assessors. They can issue some recommendations, but they can also not issue any recommendation. And indeed, while at the end of the global benchmarking tool of the benchmarking, an IDP, an institutional development plan, is developed, this is not developed at the end of the performance evaluation. So the concept is either this authority is already at the level of the WHO listed authority or is not there, but it doesn't need to be built the capacity, at least from WHO. Is not an obvious consequence that WHO will give capacity building. And in fact, capacity building activities are not included or not considered after the by default, let's say, are not considered after the performance evaluation, while they are generally considered for after the benchmarking and as well as the follow-up actions. One last thing I want to remind you, this is important for the pharmacovigilance function. You know that in performance evaluation, we do have a so-called modular approach. This has been requested by member states to ensure that there is a little bit of flexibility in attaining the WLA designation and gives the possibility to reach this designation one by one function by function. So I would like to clarify this point because this is important in general. So this is how it works. You know that each and every regulatory system which wants to be listed needs to be ML3 in all functions. Okay, okay? So this is the starting point, is having ML3 in all functions, not just the function that you want to be listed. On top of this is also mandatory and included in the operational guidance. You need to demonstrate full implementation of the requirements for the performance evaluation under the regulatory system function. So these are, let's say, the minimum common denominator of each and every WHO listed authorities or authorities that reach the listing. Then on top of this, we can build one by one the regulatory function. So in the sense of, in the case of the vigilance function, we can have full implementation of maturity level for mandatory PE indicators and PE tools to have the function listed. What does that mean? If you see one regulatory system which is listed only for the vigilance, it means that at least all the rest is ML3, that the regulatory system is at the level of WLA, and it will be listed in the vigilance function. And another important thing, the vigilance function is one of the few functions which is not directly cross-linked to other functions for its listing, but it is one of the components which is important to be implemented if we want to list for market surveillance and control. Market surveillance and control is another regulatory function that, as you know, is the most cross-cutting function which we have in the regulatory system, and it needs a number of other functions to be implemented in order for the function itself, for the market control function itself to be listed. So basically, it needs MA, VL, it needs regulatory inspection, and it needs also laboratory testing. So in case you don't reach the full implementation of all requirements of a vigilance function, this will affect also the market control, while the opposite is not applicable. And with this, I would like just to remind you that there is a page in which all this information are included, a web page, and this is the link of the web page where you can find all this information. And I thank you for your attention.